Well, yes, I am a banker, so there was at least a banker in the room. I was talking to Mo now about negative rates. That could be an interesting topic today because most of the people in this room today could live without having money which is actually bank debt. The other people today can only have electronic money if they go through bank debt. And this is the reason why they have to accept to keep their wealth into something that can have negative rates. So banks and central banks in this moment certainly do not want cryptocurrencies, because if people had cryptocurrencies, they could not set negative rates. It wouldn't make any sense. But unfortunately, the topic of today's talk is not about cryptocurrencies themselves, but it's about this famous blockchain technology everyone has been speaking about in my field in the latest months and years. And I'm bringing a quite peculiar perspective to it because I am a banker, but I'm also a mathematician, and in my job I deal with those crazily complex products that are called derivatives. And basically, when I looked from that perspective towards the reality, which is so well represented today here, the reality of blockchain, I felt very loudly two different positions. One position, quite well represented by this comment by someone at Goldman Sachs, is that blockchain can solve all the problems in the financial world. And then there was a reaction to this from different Bitcoin leaders that tried to explain that actually blockchain technology had been developed to reduce the reliance on trust. And if you didn't go for a trustless reality, a trustless system like Bitcoin, there was actually no application for this technology. Well, I agree with defining the first view, blockchain hype, and personally I've got also a definition for the second view that I call blockchain seclusion. Well, in my opinion, the first view is based on a misunderstanding. The misunderstanding is the idea that blockchain is a piece of technology, like, I don't know, GPUs or just parallel computing, so that you can embed it into the current system and you make it, I don't know, more efficient or faster or safer or whatever. The truth is that blockchain technology is much more a completely new business model. It is a business model where you move from a reality which is strongly based on trust, and you try to reduce this reliance and using various bits of technology inside a new business model. Clearly, if you don't accept to move your business to a new stage which is less reliant on trust, you can do nothing with this new technology. On the other hand, I think that also the second view that has been voiced quite loudly in the last months, the idea that you can do nothing with this technology beyond Bitcoins, is based on another misunderstanding. Well, actually, Bitcoin reached an incredible level of independence on trust. So much that you can allow people that are pseudonymous and are essentially not protected by the legal system to trade and to deal with each other. Banks and financial institutions will never be able to reach this level of lack of reliance on trust. They will always be very well identified, they will always be regulated and protected, very protected by the legal system, and so certainly they cannot reach this level. Yet there are many bits in the current financial system which are incredibly reliant from technology. You can get from trust. You can use some of the bits of technology that are used in the blockchain space in order to reduce the level of trust also dramatically, and yet you come out with something that is still different from Bitcoins. In any case, what the press got reading my research was a very rough synthesis, that is, Blockchain won't work for banks if banks do not change. As a rough synthesis, that's probably quite correct. The real point is that we tend to use this concept of trust in a quite black or white sense. There is a reality which is totally trustless in the world of Bitcoin. In a general sense, even the world of Bitcoins now has created some trust relationship. And on the other end, we have got a financial world, the one surrounding us here in the City of London, which is totally based on a corporative trust between big counterparties. No, reality is much more nuanced. And there are elements of trust nowadays in the financial system that not even banks actually want. One amazing thing from the peculiar perspective of complex financial products is that there is an incredible reliance on the agreement in the representation of a trade between two counterparties without any automation or any consensus system that can actually guarantee this coincidence in representations. And that's an element of trust that most banks would be very happy to reduce. But let us understand a little bit how we can use the concept of trust in a more precise way as a tool to analyze the dynamics and the problems of a business model. What would be a real business model completely relying on trust? You can imagine two banks that are walking in the street, Barclays and Royal Bank of Scotland. At some point, Barclays say, hey, hello, shall we make a swap where I pay LIBOR, you pay that fixed rate, and then we collateralize that in an honest way with a collateral that really represents the value of this product? Okay, that's great. They shake hands and they start trading. That would be totally reliant on trust. If there were no witnesses, that would be completely reliant on trust. The financial system nowadays does something better. They fill the world with contracts. They sign a lot of paper about that. And obviously, these very standardized, in some sense, contracts represent essentially their protection from giving too much trust to the counterparty. Yet, the reality is that after signing the papers, they go back to their own offices and each one gives to the product, to the deal, its own representation that depends on its own accounting choices, its own data, its own system, and its own models. Obviously, you cannot make sure that your representation coincides with the one of the counterparty, so you have to check many times. And very often you find out that two representations do not coincide, and you have to do something to go again to some level of agreement. That's a system that has been called consensus by reconciliation. It's a system which is intrinsically slow, it is inefficient, it is very risky, it is a business model that requires you to keep a lot of capital because you have got a lot of uncertainty. In this chart, I'm representing the normal fact that when two banks are dealing with a complex financial product, the amount of collateral you receive is never the one you expected. If the difference is not so big, you go on trading. When the difference becomes too big, you start a reconciliation, which is this quite cloudy process. But things can go even worse, because, for example, you may have just paid a big cash flow. This changes dramatically how much you are exposed to the counterparty risk on the other side. If collateral does not reach you instantaneously, for some time you are open to an enormous risk. And then if your counterparty starts not to pay, you have nothing to do if not waiting. When you realize you are waiting too much, you can start opening a default procedure, which is an enormously manual and clumsy process where you ask other banks to give a valuation of the actual portfolio between the two counterparties. Each bank will have its own system, their own understanding of the product. At times, they can be as different as a rectangle and a parallelogram, as I represented here. And this business model has been particularly penalized in the latest years. This business model was created 100 years ago, something like that, and it has never really changed. Under the latest years, many things have stressed it. It was one of the reasons at the root of the financial crisis. It is at the center of the reaction of many regulations that we had after the crisis. And it is the reason why banks nowadays have to keep so much capital, for example, against counterparty risk. No real alternative business model had ever been seen in the financial space. The Bitcoin business model was obviously based on completely different first principles, and that's what catched the interest of many bankers. What can really be interesting from a blockchain business model for this reality? First of all, a very simple idea. It's very simple, but the idea that everyone has got one standard, common reporting place, what some people call the distributed ledger, which is a way to say that rather than having many secret and very peculiar ledgers, there is one shared fully with your counterparties. And there is something more in Bitcoin. There is the logic of a consensus algorithm, a process that checks, according to any rules, that there is consensus and then gives a unique representation to a trade, to a transaction. Much more difficult to need many reconciliations when you have to do something like that. And if you want to extend this logic to complex products that involve many payments, well, you can look at the reality of Ethereum, for example, and the sort of smart contracts they have there. There you can have different logics. You can maybe change from actual execution of the contract from the smart contract to just a smart contract that manages the execution in order to reduce the risk of a DDoS scandal. But certainly the logic of smart contract is automating some of the processes that now are totally relying on counterparty eagerness to operate them, and in this way also automating some of your protection against counterparties' misbehavior. In this way, basically enforcing consensus along the entire length of the deal, that in some cases in derivatives can even be something like 30 years. What's the big change to the business model? Is that from the two bankers going back to their own offices and each one giving its own representation and its own management to the deal, you force them to give a common representation on a network. And to get a little bit more precise, without tiring you too much with details on how financial derivatives work, financial derivatives have a lot of problems in the current business model that need to be changed with a different business model. First of all, the process of collateralizing a derivative, so the process of providing guarantees that can make your counterparty feel a little bit protected from your default, is complex. It's manual, it requires a lot of models, documents, and so on. Bringing that to a smart contract logic can make it easier for the buy side. Nowadays, only banks can deal with that complex and obscure process. Second, the current business model, as we have just said, is strongly based on reconciliation. It is based on disagreement in representation and a need of reconciliation. Also because of this, it's slow. Even the best collateral agreements have a few days of delay between when an exposure is generated and when collateral is received. And finally, as we said, there are very serious problems surrounding the possibility of a default. The possibility that default happens between a mismatch between a cash flow payment and the provision of collateral, and the risk that the process goes on in an unpredictable way with unpredictable results. Well, can we think of a different business model? Yes, we can. We can think of a smart contract management of these products that put the buy side on a fairer playing field with banks. We can think of a logic where there is one consensus process and one single representation of trades to avoid the need of so much reconciliation. We can think something more. We can think that a smart contract contractually manages a trade in such a way that cash flows are actually paid only when collateral has been actually paid by the counterparty, basically reducing all the blue part of risk that we have got in this picture down to the black one. And there is even something more. We can even think that eventually counterparties have automized covenants agreed at the beginning. What are covenants? Covenants are clauses in your contract that allows you to protect yourself from misbehavior of the counterparty. The smart contract can implement that automatically. If you are not paying, your counterparty will be able to gradually close down through a pre-agreed algorithm the trades that create its own exposure. And obviously, the final hope is to reduce this incredibly long and uncertain period to something dramatically short, but because of more agreement, because of more transparency. Well, if you are interested in the details, these are two references. I want to spend some time on another important point. The things that I've just told you today are not only my opinion or something that I noticed during my job. Many people had already noticed that, and I looked for solutions. And these solutions were all centralized, like, for example, the famous central counterparties that are now so important in our business. What could be the motivation to move from some centralized solutions that are already visible to a decentralized solution, more similar to a blockchain business model? Well, everyone here knows what the concept of single point of failure is, and what is the concept of being or not being fault tolerant. But we usually have a technological vision of what a single point of failure actually is. But there is also an economic part of it. When there is a single point of failure, like a central counterparty, this party is bearing the largest part of the operational risk. So they obviously ask for the powers of an administrator of the system. When they ask for the powers of to be an administrator of the system, they tend to set their own rules and to behave like a monopolist. So even if technologically can be an efficient solution, economically, in the end, it is not. But there is something more in the financial world, that a single point of failure is usually also bearing on its shoulder the majority of the financial risk. And regulators notice that, and so increase incredibly the level of compliance and of capital that need to surround this sort of business. And even in recent opinions by regulations, they are becoming more and more aware that this model is, in the end, economically very expensive. That's the reason why a decentralized solution can be interesting in this space. And notice that in this reality, central bodies like CCPs do not necessarily disappear, because fortunately or unfortunately, in the regulated financial system, you still need entities to be accountable for the different passages of the business. But they could change completely their business model, moving to a reality where they bear all the risk on their own shoulders in moments in which nothing is happening to the market, creating in this moment a big risk, even in a moment of no actual problems, to a reality where instead they do not become central counterparties during normal times, and they do not lead to this big single point of failure in the market, but they have a role in case there are problems. The way I've defined them in my paper, they become counterparties of last resort. Okay, these things are certainly very far away in time, but I actually believe that this will be a direction taken by financial players if they don't want to be wiped out just by the obvious age of their business model. And there are also some people that are actually working on that. You know, I noticed some guys from Clearmatics here in this room, and they are doing a great job in looking at this problem and providing technological solutions. Thank you very much.